I stepped into the steam-filled bathroom, my heart racing with anticipation. Pulling back the shower curtain, I expected to see my husband's familiar smile, ready for a moment of rekindled passion. But instead, I froze. Standing there was Ethan, my son, his eyes wide with shock, his face mirroring my disbelief. Time stopped. What was supposed to be a moment of love turned into something that would change everything forever. Ethan was my only son, and for years, he was my light in an otherwise dim world. Adrian, my husband, had always been the ambitious type. He'd throw himself into work, returning home late, often distracted, and sometimes, not at all. Our once lively dinners filled with laughter and conversation had dwindled into silent meals shared under the glow of dim kitchen lights. We weren't always like this. I remember the early days, spontaneous dates, heartfelt letters, and the kind of love that made you believe in forever. Adrian used to surprise me with flowers and small gestures, the kind of things that told me I was cherished. But those moments had faded, replaced by his curt replies and endless phone calls. It wasn't just Adrian's distance that weighed on me. I had devoted years to building a home, raising Ethan, and being the glue that held our family together. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of myself. My life became a routine of taking care of others while my own needs faded into the background. Ethan, once the little boy who would cling to my leg, had grown into a young man almost overnight. His gangly frame had been replaced by a confident posture. He spoke less now, his world revolving around friends, school, and the occasional moments he'd spend in his room, lost in his music or books. I missed the days when he'd come to me with scraped knees and stories about his day. When Adrian suggested I take a break at the cabin, it felt like an escape from the monotony and the growing emptiness. But even then, he didn't offer to join us. He simply said, "You and Ethan go ahead. I'll catch up later." Those words hung in the air, heavy with implications I couldn't ignore. So, I packed our bags and drove Ethan and me to the mountains. I told myself this trip was about reconnecting with my son, about finding a piece of myself in the quiet of the woods. But beneath that, there was an ache I couldn't name, a longing for something I couldn't put into words. The cabin had always been a sanctuary, a place where memories of happier times lingered in the creaking wooden floors and the scent of cedar in the air. But this time, it felt different. The warmth it once offered seemed hollow now, the silence deafening rather than comforting. Ethan and I settled in quickly. He spent most of his time chopping wood or scrolling through his phone near the fireplace, his face illuminated by the flicker of the flames. I busied myself cleaning and organizing, trying to focus on the here and now rather than the distance that had grown between all of us, Adrian, Ethan, and even myself. But it wasn't long before I started noticing things that unsettled me. Ethan was no longer the awkward teenager I had tucked into bed just a few years ago. His confidence, his quiet strength, it was impossible to ignore. The way he carried himself reminded me of Adrian during our early days, back when his attention made me feel seen, cherished, alive. I felt ashamed of the comparison, but I couldn't stop my mind from drawing those lines. It was small things at first. The way Ethan's gaze lingered just a moment too long during our conversations. His habit of touching my arm gently as he passed me in the kitchen. He offered to help me with the smallest tasks, lighting the fire, preparing dinner, and while it seemed innocent, there was an energy in those moments that I couldn't quite place. One evening, as we sat in the soft glow of the fireplace, I broke the silence. "Do you ever feel like something's missing?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. Ethan glanced up from his book, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But maybe that's just how life is. We grow up, and things change." His words struck a chord. The boy who once idolized his father now spoke with a maturity that made my chest tighten. He didn't say it outright, but I could sense his disillusionment with Adrian, his understanding of the cracks in our family. The bitterness in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. The tension between us grew in ways I didn't understand. One afternoon, as I stood by the window, watching him chop wood outside, I felt a pang of guilt for the thoughts swirling in my mind. I told myself it was just nostalgia, the longing for the closeness we used to share when he was a boy. But there was something else, something I couldn't admit, even to myself. That night, as I sat on the couch flipping through an old book, Ethan surprised me by joining me, sitting close enough that our arms brushed. My breath hitched at the unexpected intimacy of the moment, and I forced myself to focus on the book in my lap. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice low and steady. "Is everything okay?" I nodded, avoiding his gaze. "Just tired," I replied, though the truth was far more complicated. The weight of his presence was almost suffocating, his closeness stirring feelings I didn't want to name. But it wasn't just me. Ethan seemed different, too. His gestures were more deliberate, his words careful and measured. He'd grown into someone I barely recognized, yet his warmth, the way he looked at me, reminded me of a time when I felt truly seen. It was a dangerous thought, one I buried deep within, even as it gnawed at the edges of my mind. The cracks in the fragile balance of our relationship were growing. I could feel it in the charged silences, the fleeting touches, the way my pulse quickened when he was near. The tension was unbearable, but I couldn't bring myself to confront it. Instead, I let it build, like a storm gathering strength just beyond the horizon. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier, charged with an unspoken energy that neither Ethan nor I dared to acknowledge. The isolation of the mountains seemed to amplify everything: the creak of the wooden floorboards, the crackle of the fire, and the unsteady rhythm of my heartbeat whenever Ethan was near. I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't just his physical presence, the broad shoulders, the quiet confidence, but the way he looked at me. There was an intensity in his gaze, a depth that seemed to see through the carefully constructed walls I'd built around myself. It both unsettled and intrigued me. One evening, after dinner, Ethan offered to clean up while I curled up by the fire. I tried to focus on the book in my hands, but my eyes kept drifting to him. He moved with ease and purpose, his every action deliberate. When he finally joined me, sitting just a little closer than usual, I felt the tension between us like a tangible thing. "You've been different lately," he said softly, breaking the silence. "Quieter." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Just thinking," I murmured. "About everything." He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "You don't have to carry it all, you know. It's okay to let someone in." His words struck a nerve, opening a floodgate of emotions I had tried so hard to keep in check. I looked away, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. "It's not that simple, Ethan," I whispered. He reached out, his hand brushing mine, a light, fleeting touch that sent a shiver down my spine. "Maybe it is," he said, his voice steady and calm. "You just have to let yourself believe it." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to shrink, the space between us charged with something I couldn't name. His hand lingered near mine, his fingers brushing against my skin as if testing a boundary neither of us wanted to cross. "I don't think this is a good idea," I said finally, my voice trembling. Ethan pulled his hand back, his expression unreadable. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said quickly. "You didn't," I replied, though the words felt hollow. The truth was far more complicated. I was uncomfortable not because of him, but because of the way he made me feel. It was a dangerous line we were treading, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to step away. The next day, the tension only grew. Ethan and I spent the morning in relative silence, each lost in our own thoughts. By the afternoon, I decided to take a walk, hoping the crisp mountain air would clear my head. Ethan joined me without a word, his presence a steady, quiet comfort. We walked in silence, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet the only sound. At one point, I stumbled over a root, and Ethan reached out to steady me, his hand warm and firm against my arm. "Careful," he said, his voice soft but filled with concern. I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Thanks." When we returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the trees. Ethan lit the fire while I prepared a simple dinner. The silence between us was heavy, but it wasn't the kind of silence that demanded to be filled. It was charged, alive with everything we weren't saying. Later that evening, as we sat by the fire, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed, a small smile playing on his lips. "This place feels different now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How so?" I asked, curious despite myself. He opened his eyes, meeting my gaze with an intensity that made my breath catch. "It feels Closer. Like it's just us, and nothing else matters. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I wanted to dismiss them, to laugh it off as nothing more than idle talk. But I couldn't. There was something in his tone, in the way he looked at me, that made it impossible to ignore. I stood abruptly, needing to break the moment. I should get some sleep, I said, my voice unsteady. Ethan nodded but didn't move. Good night, Mom, he said softly, his gaze lingering on me as I walked to my room. But sleep didn't come. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything that had happened and everything that hadn't. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in as I wrestled with emotions I didn't want to face. The lines between us were blurring, and I was powerless to stop it. Every moment, every glance, every fleeting touch seemed to draw us closer to something I couldn't name but couldn't deny. It was wrong. I knew that. But knowing didn't make it any easier to resist. The storm inside me was growing, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it consumed us both. The storm that had been brewing between us finally broke one evening. It began like so many other nights at the cabin, with the quiet crackle of the fire and the soft hum of the forest outside. But the air felt heavier, charged with an energy that neither of us could ignore. I had just finished washing the dishes from dinner when Ethan approached me, his presence filling the small kitchen. "Do you want to sit by the fire?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. I hesitated, glancing at the couch where we had spent so many evenings in loaded silence. "Sure," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. We settled into the familiar space, the warmth of the fire wrapping around us. Ethan sat close, closer than he usually did, and I felt his presence like a physical weight. I tried to focus on the book in my hands, but the words blurred on the page, my thoughts consumed by the tension between us. After a while, Ethan broke the silence. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone gentle but firm. I looked up, startled. "I haven't," I protested, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. He tilted his head, his eyes searching mine. "You have," he said. "And I don't understand why." My breath caught in my throat. How could I explain the tangle of emotions I'd been trying so hard to suppress? How could I put into words the confusion, the guilt, the undeniable pull I felt whenever he was near? "I'm just tired," I said finally, looking away. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing mine. The touch was light, fleeting, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said softly. His words broke something inside me. I turned to face him, my eyes filling with tears. "Ethan, this isn't, we can't," I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. He leaned closer, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Why not?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why do we have to keep pretending?" "Because it's wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "Because you're my son, and this isn't right." For a moment, there was silence. Then Ethan reached up, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from my face. "I'm not a child anymore," he said, his voice filled with an intensity that made my heart pound. "I know what I feel, and I know you feel it too." I shook my head, tears spilling down my cheeks. "Ethan, please," I whispered. "This isn't something we can do." But he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned closer, his hand cupping my cheek. "I don't care about the rules," he said. "I just care about you." His words shattered the last of my resolve. I closed my eyes, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I felt his lips brush against mine. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than a statement. But as the seconds stretched into eternity, it deepened, becoming something neither of us could deny. When we finally pulled apart, the weight of what we had done crashed down around us. I stared at him, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts and emotions. "This can't happen again," I said, my voice barely audible. Ethan nodded, but his eyes told a different story. "I know," he said. "But that doesn't change how I feel." The days that followed were a blur of tension and unspoken words. We avoided each other as much as possible, retreating into separate corners of the cabin. But the memory of that night lingered, a shadow that followed me wherever I went. And then Adrian arrived. It was late in the afternoon when I heard the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. My heart sank as I watched him step out, his face a mask of indifference. "Sorry I'm late," he said, brushing past me as he carried his bag into the cabin. Ethan emerged from his room, his expression unreadable. "Dad," he said, his voice neutral. Adrian barely acknowledged him, his attention already on his phone. "Hope you two haven't been too bored without me," he said with a forced smile. The tension in the cabin was palpable. I could feel Ethan's eyes on me, could sense the weight of everything we weren't saying. Adrian, oblivious as always, seemed content to ignore the undercurrent that had transformed the atmosphere. That evening, as we sat around the dining table, the silence was deafening. Adrian talked about work, about the latest project that had kept him so busy, but his words felt hollow. Ethan barely spoke, his responses clipped and monosyllabic. After dinner, Adrian excused himself to take a call, leaving Ethan and me alone in the dimly lit kitchen. I busied myself washing the dishes, my hands trembling as I tried to focus on the mundane task. "I don't know how you put up with him," Ethan said suddenly, his voice low. I glanced at him, startled. "He's your father," I said, though the words felt empty even as I said them. Ethan shook his head, his expression hard. "He doesn't care about you," he said. "Not like I do." His words sent a jolt through me. I turned away, my breath hitching as I tried to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "This isn't about him," I said, my voice trembling. Ethan stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "Maybe it should be," he said. "Maybe it's time you stopped pretending." Before I could respond, Adrian returned, his presence breaking the moment. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, glancing between us. "Fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just finishing up." But nothing was fine. The lines had been crossed, the boundaries shattered, and there was no going back. The weight of the forbidden hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of what had been done and what could never be undone. The cabin, once a place of solace, had become a prison, a place where the truth couldn't be escaped, no matter how hard I tried. The days following Adrian's arrival felt like a slow unraveling. The cabin, already heavy with tension, became stifling. The air between Ethan and me was charged, every glance and every accidental touch laced with the memory of what we had done. Adrian, oblivious as always, carried on as though everything was normal, but normal no longer existed. I threw myself into the motions of daily life, desperate to create some sense of routine. Meals were prepared and eaten in heavy silence. Adrian spent most of his time glued to his phone or laptop, his work taking precedence even here, in the heart of the mountains. Ethan's demeanor, usually calm and steady, became restless. He would disappear for hours into the woods, leaving me to stew in the isolation of my thoughts. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting the cabin in long, flickering shadows, Adrian suggested a family movie night. "Let's try to make the most of this trip," he said, his tone light but forced. I agreed, hoping the distraction would ease the unbearable tension. Ethan shrugged in response, his expression unreadable. We gathered in the small living room, the fire crackling softly in the background. Adrian picked a movie, something light-hearted, a comedy that felt jarring against the weight of everything unspoken. I sat between them, the physical space between Ethan and me a chasm that mirrored the emotional one. Halfway through the film, Adrian's phone buzzed, and he excused himself to take the call. Ethan and I were left alone, the flickering light from the screen dancing across the walls. The silence between us was deafening, broken only by the sounds of the movie. "I can't do this anymore," Ethan said suddenly, his voice low but firm. I turned to him, my heart pounding. "Ethan, don't." "Don't what?" he interrupted, his gaze intense. "Pretend this didn't happen? Pretend I don't feel the way I do?" I glanced toward the hallway, panic surging through me. Adrian's muffled voice carried from the other room, a stark reminder of the delicate line we were walking. "Please," I whispered. "Not here. Not now." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded, leaning back into the couch. The moment passed, but the weight of it lingered, hanging over us like a storm cloud. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the silence of the cabin pressed in around me. Adrian was already asleep beside me, his soft snores a reminder of the life we'd built together, a life that now felt like a distant memory. My thoughts were a tangled web of guilt, shame, and something else I didn't want to name. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face, heard his voice, felt the weight of his touch. I knew what had happened between us was wrong, unforgivable. But the feelings didn't go away. They lingered, festering like a wound that refused to heal. I wanted to rewind time, to erase the moment that had set everything in motion. But it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no going back. The next morning, as I sat on the porch sipping coffee, Ethan joined me. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his presence a quiet comfort. Finally, he spoke. "I'm leaving." I looked up at him, startled. "What?" "I can't stay here," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Not like this." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? That I understood. That I felt the same way. The truth was, I didn't want him to go, but I also knew it was the only way to salvage what was left of our family. "When?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Today," he replied. "I'll tell Dad I need to get back to work on a project for school." I nodded, the weight of his decision settling over me like a lead blanket. "Okay." Ethan hesitated, then reached out, his hand brushing mine. The gesture was brief, but it was enough to send my heart racing. "Take care of yourself," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "You too," I whispered. When Adrian woke, Ethan gave him the excuse about school. Adrian barely looked up from his phone, muttering something about being proud of his dedication. Within hours, Ethan was gone, the sound of his car fading into the distance. The cabin felt emptier than ever after that. Adrian, oblivious to the undercurrents that had shaped our time there, suggested extending the trip, but I refused. "I think it's time we went home," I said, my voice firm. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling of finality. This wasn't just the end of the trip, it was the end of something far greater. I didn't know how to move forward, how to face the wreckage of what had happened. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same. The drive home from the cabin was silent, the weight of everything that had transpired lingering like a storm cloud. Adrian drove, his focus on the road, unaware of the internal chaos that consumed me. I stared out the window, the passing scenery a blur as my thoughts raced. Ethan's absence was palpable, a void that I couldn't ignore no matter how hard I tried. At home, life returned to its predictable rhythm, or at least, it tried to. Adrian threw himself back into his work, his phone and laptop once again becoming his constant companions. I went through the motions, cleaning, cooking, and pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was unraveling. Ethan's departure had left a hole in my life that I didn't know how to fill. I missed him in ways I couldn't explain, his voice, his presence, the way he made me feel seen in a way Adrian hadn't for years. But along with that longing came guilt, a relentless weight that bore down on me day and night. I replayed the events at the cabin over and over in my mind, searching for answers, for some way to make sense of it all. How had things spiraled so far out of control? What had I done to allow the lines to blur, to let the boundaries shatter? The questions haunted me, but the answers remained elusive. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the quiet hum of the house pressing in around me, I picked up my phone. My finger hovered over Ethan's number, the temptation to call him almost overwhelming. But I stopped myself. What could I possibly say? There were no words that could undo what had happened, no way to erase the choices we had made. Instead, I put the phone down and closed my eyes, letting the tears come. I cried for the family we had been, for the mistakes I had made, for the impossible feelings I couldn't escape. The grief was suffocating, but it was also cleansing, a release I hadn't allowed myself until that moment. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding. Not just with Adrian, but with myself. I started therapy, something I had avoided for years, too afraid to confront the depths of my own emotions. I began journaling, pouring my thoughts onto the page in an attempt to make sense of them. Slowly, I started to find clarity. Through therapy, I realized how deeply I had neglected my own needs, how much of myself I had lost in the process of trying to hold our family together. I began to see that the feelings I had for Ethan were less about him and more about the emptiness within me, a desperate attempt to fill a void I hadn't known how to confront. Adrian noticed the changes, and though our conversations were still stilted and awkward, there was a flicker of something, an acknowledgement that things had to change if we were going to move forward. He started coming home earlier, putting his phone away during dinner, and making small efforts to reconnect. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Ethan and I didn't speak for months. The distance was painful, but it was necessary. I needed the space to heal, to confront my own demons, and to find a way to forgive myself. When we finally did speak, it was cautious, tentative, a step toward mending what had been broken. "I'm sorry for everything," I said during that first phone call, my voice trembling. "I am too," he replied, his tone soft but firm. "But I think we both know it's better this way." We didn't dwell on the past. Instead, we talked about the future, about his plans for school, about the life he was building for himself. It wasn't the relationship we had before, but it was something, a foundation we could rebuild on, piece by piece. In the end, the experience left me with a painful but necessary lesson. I learned that neglecting your own needs, your own happiness, can lead you down dangerous paths. I learned the importance of boundaries, of honesty, and of facing your own vulnerabilities head-on. Most importantly, I learned that healing is possible, even in the wake of profound mistakes. The scars of that time will always remain, a reminder of what was lost and what was learned. But with time, I've come to see them not as marks of failure, but as evidence of growth, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of forgiveness, both for others and for ourselves. If you were in her shoes, how would you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video if it kept you on the edge of your seat, and subscribe for more shocking stories that reveal the hidden complexities of love, betrayal, and redemption. Stay tuned, our next story will leave you speechless. Let me know if you'd like any changes or additions.